Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment my life changed forever. It wasn't when I first met James, or even when I first kissed him in the dimly lit parking lot behind Joey's diner. It was on a mundane Tuesday morning in March, when Mike forgot to kiss me goodbye before heading to the factory. I remember standing at our cramped kitchen sink, the yellow linoleum peeling at the corners, watching him through the window as he trudged to his beaten-up Ford pickup. 10 years of marriage, and that morning was the first time he'd forgotten. It shouldn't have mattered. We'd long since passed the honeymoon phase, but something inside me cracked. I'm Sarah Williams, and this is my confession. The thing about working at Joey's diner is that you become invisible after a while. Just another uniformed body pouring coffee and serving plates of greasy eggs to tired workers. I'd been there for 6 years, ever since Mike lost his job at the first factory, and we needed extra income. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but the tips helped keep our heads above water. That spring was particularly harsh in our corner of Michigan. The factory where Mike worked had been threatening layoffs, and our savings account hadn't seen a deposit in months. Our small rental house needed repairs we couldn't afford, and the dream of having children seemed further away than ever. James Cooper started coming to the diner in April. He wasn't like our usual customers, the factory workers with their calloused hands and weary eyes, or the local retirees nursing cups of coffee for hours. He drove one of those massive 18-wheelers, making regular runs between Detroit and Chicago. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines around his eyes, he carried himself with an ease I hadn't seen in years. "Just passing through," he'd said that first morning, sliding onto a stool at the counter. His smile reached his eyes, something I noticed immediately because it was so rare these days. "Aren't we all?" I'd replied, pouring him coffee without asking. It was a line I'd used hundreds of times before, but something about the way he chuckled made me feel like I'd said something profound. Linda, my coworker, noticed my lingering glances. "Careful there, Sarah," she'd warned during our smoke break behind the diner. "That road leads nowhere good." Linda had been through 2 divorces and knew all about nowhere good, but I brushed off her concern with a laugh. "I'm married, Linda, just being friendly." But James kept coming back, always sitting in my section, always with that same warm smile. He'd tell me stories about the places he'd been, the sunset over the Arizona desert, the neon lights of Las Vegas, the rolling hills of Tennessee. His words painted pictures of a world so different from my own, where each day bled into the next in an endless cycle of work, TV dinners, and silent nights. Mike never noticed the change in me at first. He was too wrapped up in his own struggles at the factory, coming home late with grease-stained clothes and a perpetual furrow in his brow. We'd gotten married right out of high school, more because it seemed like the next logical step than out of any grand passion. He was the only man I'd ever been with, and for years, that had seemed like enough. The first time James touched me was innocent enough, his hand brushing against mine as I refilled his coffee cup. But the jolt of electricity that shot through me was anything but innocent. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw the same hunger I felt reflected in his gaze. "When do you get off work?" he asked quietly, his voice rougher than usual. 4, I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'll be in the lot." I spent the rest of my shift in a daze, nearly dropping plates and mixing up orders. Linda watched me with knowing eyes but said nothing. At 4 o'clock, I changed out of my uniform with trembling hands, telling myself I was just going to talk, that nothing would happen. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. James was waiting in his truck, the engine idling. Without a word, I climbed into the passenger seat, the door closing behind me with a finality that should have terrified me. He drove us to the old overlook outside town, where teenagers used to park to make out. We sat in silence for a long moment, watching the sun sink behind the factory smokestacks. "You're married," he said finally, not looking at me. "Yes." "Happy?" I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. I don't even remember what that feels like anymore. His kiss, when it came, was nothing like Mike's familiar pecks. It was hungry, desperate, like a man starved for air. I should have stopped it there, should have gotten out of his truck and walked home, but instead, I kissed him back with all the pent-up frustration of my suffocating life. "I'm not looking to wreck your marriage," James whispered against my neck. "But I can't stop thinking about you." I wish I could say it was just physical attraction, that it was only about the thrill of something new. But James made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. When I talked, he listened, really listened, not just nodding while staring at the TV. He asked questions about my dreams, my fears, the person I'd wanted to be before life got in the way. Our meetings became regular, carefully planned around his delivery schedule and my shifts. Sometimes we'd just talk in his truck, sharing stories and stolen kisses. Other times, we'd drive to the next town over, where nobody knew us, and pretend we were different people entirely. In cheap motel rooms with faded wallpaper, I discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. Mike remained oblivious, too consumed by his own struggles to notice the changes in me. The factory had cut another shift, and he was working overtime whenever he could get it. We barely saw each other anymore, and when we did, the silence between us was deafening. I told myself this made what I was doing less wrong somehow, as if his emotional absence justified my physical one. Linda tried to warn me again one morning as we set up for the breakfast rush. "He's going to leave, you know," she said, counting sugar packets. "Men like that always do. They've got wheels under them for a reason." "It's not like that," I insisted, but even then, I knew she was right. James had a life on the road, a freedom I both envied and feared. Whatever we had was borrowed time, a temporary escape from reality. The guilt came in waves. Sometimes I could go days without feeling it, floating on the high of James's attention and affection. Then it would hit me all at once, usually late at night, when Mike's steady breathing beside me reminded me of the vows I'd made. I'd slip out of bed and sit in our tiny bathroom, silently crying as I stared at my reflection, wondering when I'd become someone I didn't recognize. June brought a heat wave and complications. James's route changed, meaning he could only stop by every other week instead of weekly. The reduced schedule made our meetings more intense, more desperate. We took bigger risks, meeting during my lunch breaks, exchanging heated glances across the diner when other drivers from his company were present. It was bound to fall apart. Looking back, I'm amazed we managed to keep it secret for as long as we did. The beginning of the end came on a sweltering July afternoon. I was supposed to be working a double shift, but James had surprised me by showing up unexpectedly. We drove to our usual motel, lost in each other, forgetting about time and consequences. When I finally checked my phone, I had 5 missed calls from Linda. "The place is swamped," she hissed when I called back. "Mike came by looking for you, said he got sent home early because of the heat and wanted to surprise you with lunch." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "That you weren't feeling well and went home." "You owe me big time, Sarah, but you need to get your ass back here now." I practically ran from the motel room, leaving James calling after me. The drive back to the diner was a blur of panic and hastily constructed lies. But when I arrived, my hands shaking as I tied my apron back on, I knew something was different. The other waitresses wouldn't meet my eyes, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Linda pulled me into the storage room, her face grave. "Remember Tommy from the garage next door? He saw you getting into James's truck. He told Mike's cousin, who works with him at the factory." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Does Mike know? "Not yet, but honey, it's a small town. You know how these things work." I spent the rest of my shift in a fog of dread, jumping every time the bell above the door chimed. When I got home that evening, Mike was sitting in the dark living room, a half-empty bottle of beer in his hand. He didn't look up when I entered. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice flat. "What?" "Linda said you went home sick today." He finally looked at me and the pain in his eyes made me take a step back. "Funny thing is, I went home to check on you. House was empty. Car was gone." The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch for an eternity. My mouth went dry, and my heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Mike, I don't." He held up his hand, still not looking at me. "Just, don't lie to me anymore. Tommy saw you, with him, the truck driver." I sank into our threadbare armchair, my legs unable to support me any longer. This was the moment I'd been dreading, yet somehow, I'd never really prepared for it. What could I say? How do you explain to your husband of 10 years that you've been living a double life? "How long?" Mike's voice cracked on the question. 3 months, I whispered, the truth finally spilling out. "Since April." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound that made me flinch. 3 months. Jesus Christ, Sarah. He stood up suddenly, the beer bottle falling to the carpet with a dull thud. "Do you love him?" "I don't know." It was the truth, but it felt like another betrayal. Mike started pacing, running his hands through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. I knew something was different. I knew it, but I thought maybe you were just finally happy again. Turns out you were happy, just not with me. "We haven't been happy together for a long time, Mike," I said softly. "We barely talk anymore. We're like strangers living in the same house." So this is my fault? His voice rose, anger finally breaking through the shock. Because I'm working my ass off trying to keep us afloat? Because I'm not some exciting traveler with stories about sunsets and city lights? No, that's not. You're my wife, he shouted, making me jump. You're supposed to be the one person I can count on. The one thing in my life that makes all the shit worth it. Tears were streaming down my face now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry you did it, or sorry you got caught. I didn't have an answer for that. Mike stormed out of the house, the screen door slamming behind him. I heard his truck start up and peel out of the driveway, gravel spraying against the side of the house. The next few days were a blur of whispered conversations and pointed stares at the diner. News travels fast in small towns, and by the end of the week, everyone knew. Some of our regular customers stopped sitting in my section. Others left bigger tips than usual, their eyes full of pity. Linda tried to run interference, but there was only so much she could do. Mike moved in with his brother, coming by the house only to pick up more clothes or necessary items. Each time, we barely spoke, the weight of my betrayal hanging heavy between us. I tried calling James, but his phone went straight to voicemail. After the third attempt, I got the message. He'd moved on, just as Linda had warned me he would. One evening, about a week after everything fell apart, I came home to find Mike sitting on our front porch. He looked tired, older somehow, like he'd aged years in just days. I talked to a lawyer today, he said without preamble. She says we can file for a no-fault divorce, make it quick and clean. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I loved you, Sarah. Since we were 16 years old, you were it for me. He stood up, hands in his pockets. I hope he was worth it. That night, I sat alone in our bedroom, my bedroom now, looking at old photos. Mike and me at prom, both of us so young and full of dreams. Our wedding day when we thought love was all we needed. Various Christmases and birthdays over the years, our smiles growing more strained in each successive photo. James never came back to the diner. Linda heard through the trucking grapevine that he'd requested a different route. Sometimes I wondered if he was telling some other lonely woman stories about sunsets and city lights, making her feel special and seen until it was time to move on again. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly quick. Mike was generous, more than I deserved. He let me keep the house, though I could barely afford it on my waitress salary. Maybe it was his final act of kindness. Or maybe he just couldn't stand the thought of living there anymore, surrounded by memories of our life together. The town's judgment was harder to bear than the divorce itself. People I'd known my entire life suddenly treated me like a pariah. Mothers would steer their daughters away from me at the grocery store, as if infidelity was contagious. The older women at church stopped inviting me to their prayer circles. Even some of my regular customers at the diner requested different servers, not wanting to be served by that kind of woman. Linda stuck by me, though. They'll find something else to gossip about eventually, she'd say during our breaks. Trust me, I've been there. Twice. But the worst part wasn't the gossip or the loneliness. It was the realization that I'd destroyed something real and permanent in pursuit of something that was never meant to last. James had been an escape, a fantasy, but Mike had been my reality. Flawed and sometimes difficult, but real. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Mike at the gas station. He was with a woman I didn't recognize, pretty in a soft, gentle way. They were laughing about something as they filled up his truck, and the sight hit me like a physical blow. He looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen in years. He noticed me and gave a small, awkward wave. The woman looked between us, obviously knowing who I was, but smiled politely anyway. I managed to wave back before hurrying to my car, tears blurring my vision. That night, I found myself driving to the overlook where James and I used to park. The factory smokestacks were still visible in the distance, their lights blinking steadily in the darkness. I thought about all the choices that had led me here, all the moments when I could have made different decisions. I could blame the monotony of small-town life, or the strain of financial struggles, or the way Mike and I had grown apart over the years. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. I had chosen this. I had chosen to seek excitement and validation in another man's arms instead of fighting for my marriage, or being honest about my unhappiness. A year after everything fell apart, I finally gathered the courage to leave town. There was nothing holding me there anymore. No marriage, no real friends besides Linda, and certainly no future. I'd saved up enough money for a security deposit on a small apartment in Grand Rapids, where nobody knew my story. The day I left, Linda hugged me tight in the diner's parking lot. "You're not the first person to make a mistake in love, honey," she said, "and you won't be the last. The trick is learning from it. As I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I thought about what she'd said. I'd learned plenty about love, about marriage, about myself. I'd learned that excitement fades, but trust, once broken, might never be repaired. I'd learned that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Sometimes it's just astroturf, artificial and temporary. Mike got married again the following spring. I heard about it from Linda, who still keeps in touch. She said the ceremony was small, just family and close friends, held in his new wife's backyard. Apparently, they're expecting their first child. Sometimes I drive past our old house, his brother bought it after I left, and wonder about the life we might have had if I'd made different choices. James crosses my mind less and less these days. He was like a shooting star, bright and beautiful, but ultimately fleeting. Mike was my son, steady, constant, life-giving, and I'd taken that for granted until it was too late. In my new life in Grand Rapids, I'm trying to rebuild. I took some community college classes, got a job as a dental receptionist. It's not exciting, but maybe that's okay. I've had enough excitement to last a lifetime. These days, I'm learning to appreciate the quiet moments, the simple pleasures, the kind of happiness that doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that Tuesday morning when Mike forgot to kiss me goodbye. Such a small thing to mark the beginning of the end. If I could go back to that moment, I'd call out to him, make him turn around, kiss him like it was the first time. But life doesn't give us second chances with the same person. It just gives us the wisdom to do better next time, if we're lucky enough to get a next time. I'm Sarah Williams, and this was my confession. Not just of my infidelity, but of my greatest regret, not realizing what I had until I'd thrown it all away. They say every mistake is a lesson, and I've certainly learned mine. Love isn't about grand gestures or exciting adventures. Sometimes it's just about showing up, day after day, choosing the same person even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. As for happiness, I'm beginning to understand that it's not something that happens to you, it's something you build, brick by brick, choice by choice. And sometimes, the most important choice is simply staying when everything in you wants to run.